Okay, hey, welcome back. We're going to talk about imperialism today. Let's see if I can get this going here. Okay, so imperialism basically really kind of kicks off this period of new imperialism. I guess we're going to look at is really going to kick off about the time of the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution is going to have this really kind of push-pull effect on imperialism, in which it's going to it's going to cause westernized nations or industrial nations to go out and look for resources outside of their borders, and at the same time they're going to go out and they're going to look for those they're going to look for markets outside of their borders. So nations that have large populations and access to raw materials are going to become very attractive to Western industrial nations during this time frame. And so the Industrial Revolution has made the Western nations very rich and powerful, and they start to look for places where they can dominate and gain access to raw materials and new markets. And so basically imperialism is just the domination of one country by another, and that could be political or economic or culturally. And you see that today. I mean, you see America oftentimes gets called an imperialistic nation because we go out and we push a lot of American political and cultural and even economic ideas on other nations, right? We love the idea of democracy. We love the idea of capitalism. And of course, American culture is probably the dominant culture in the world at this point. Europe has this history of imperialism. In 1942, you see Columbus come over to the New World. He's looking for Asia. He ends up hitting the Caribbean, and that's going to lead to this period from 1492 really until I'm going to say until 1776, where Europe dominates the New World, right, with imperialism. They set up different ideas during that time frame of mercantilism and colonies and how colonies should benefit the parent country. But really what we're looking at here in this unit is going to be this period from 1850 to 1914. And this period is going to be known as the period of new imperialism. And that's when European nations are going to turn their attention away from, away from the New World. Obviously they started to do that, and then they industrialized, but they're going to turn their attention towards setting up colonies in places like Asia and Africa. And you got to wonder, well, why would they do that? Well, obviously Asia has always been important to Europe, and during this time frame, the period of old imperialism, actually that's what Europe's going out and looking for. They're looking for ways to go to Asia and trade. But why Africa? Well, we'll talk about that here a little bit. Why wouldn't someone try to stop imperialism? Why wouldn't Europe try to stop, or why wouldn't someone try to stop Europe from forcing themselves on other people? And ultimately they do. We'll talk about that, and they're just not. And then ultimately is the question, is imperialism a form of injustice? And these are all questions that you're going to need to ask yourself. Well, first question, why imperialism? The first one is just going to be plain and simple economics. The Industrial Revolution needs resources. We need things like rubber and petroleum and iron ore and manganese and palm oils and coal and any kind of resource that can be turned into something. The industrial revolution is going to find a way to do that, right? And so you look over here at these two maps, and you can see areas that are part of other people's empires. Also, political and military interests. Well, as you start to make more stuff and sell more stuff, and you ship it abroad, obviously you're going to need fueling stations to fill up those boats, just like cars need gas stations. And so the islands of the Pacific become very important to European nations, also to become very important to America as a way to not only fuel trade with China, but also establish some kind of a military presence in the Pacific to protect our Pacific coastline. You're also trying to prevent rivals and influence of other nations. You're trying to grow your global prestige. If you have the largest imperial footprint, then other nations are going to look to you, right? Humanitarians are going to look at places like Asia and Africa and their lack of Christianity during this time as a reason to send missionaries into Africa to spread the word of Jesus and and to spread the message of the church, not only into Africa, but also Asia. They're looking to spread Western civilization, Western laws, those types of things to civilizations that Europeans during this time would consider barbaric or underdeveloped. And then we're also going to deal with this period of this idea of what we're going to refer to as, excuse me, we're going to refer to as social Darwinism. And so Darwin is a scientist, and he goes out to the Galapagos Islands and he sees animals that haven't been seen for a long time, and he starts to wonder why they look a little different than other animals, and he comes up with this theory of evolution that animals that are most able to adapt are going to be the ones that are able to survive. And so in the 1800s, we're still kind of in the aftermath of the Enlightenment, and we're taking ideas from science and trying to apply them to the natural world. And so we're going to take this idea of Darwinism and try to apply it into society. And so we'll look at underdeveloped nations and the developed nations of Europe during this time frame. We're going to be like, oh, well, we adapted, and so we're better able to survive, and so we should go out and take the resources from people that haven't used them yet. And we start to see this idea of the survival of the fittest that was never actually part of Darwin's theory. His idea was that if you're able to adapt, you're able to survive, versus social Darwinism just comes up with this idea that the survival of the fittest, where the better nations are going to go out and get the better colonies, and they're going to have the better stuff, and so they're going to be able to survive. And so if you want to be the best nation, you want to be the best, you need to go get the better stuff, right? Another reason that Europe's able to go out and get this stuff is we're going to see empires in a state of decline. You have wars in Africa, and the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade that had been going on for hundreds of years before this point, has weakened the African tribal system and the African nations, and depopulated large portions of sub-Saharan Africa. The Ottoman Empire in the Middle East is starting to had reached its peak probably by that point, and is starting to lose power. They're also not industrializing like the rest of Europe, and so Europe's going to pass the Ottomans. The Mughal Empire in India, which had controlled the subcontinent of India for hundreds of years, has a series of revolts in civil wars that's going to divide that empire into portions. And the Qin dynasty in China takes over from, and they start to deal with problems of corruption and lack of industrialization, and the Europeans catch China, and China and Asia will actually get their own little PowerPoint here. But all of these empires are losing power, and Europe is gaining power through industrialization. You look at the Ottoman Empire at its peak and how it controlled all of North Africa, and as it starts to lose power in Africa, European nations start to move in and take control of those areas. There's the Mughal Empire in India and modern day Pakistan, and then the Qin dynasty in modern day China, obviously, right? And so obviously the Western nations of Europe during this time frame are going to have advantages over some of these empires that are in decline, and they're listed here on the screen. Obviously they're going to have stronger economies. These are going to be economies that are going to be bolstered by not only industrialization, but centuries of colonization and exploitation of the New World. Most of them are going to have organized governments. You're going to have the British the British and the Dutch are really going to lead the way in colonization, and the Dutch kind of get overlooked in this presentation here. But the British have a long-standing constitutional monarchy that encourages economic growth. We talked about that during the Industrial Revolution. They have this this Protestant work ethic that's going to come about during that. England's also going to have a relatively powerful army and one of the world's best navies to protect their shipping lanes. They're going to have superior technology. They're going to be able to mass produce goods and clothe and feed and equip armies on a global scale. They're also going to invent machine guns, or at least the predecessors of machine guns, specifically the Maxim gun. And so when European countries go in and end up in military conflicts, with African tribes, or even tribal armies in places like India, or even imperial armies in China. Those armies are not going to be able to stand up to the rapid fire abilities of industrialized machine guns, right? You're also going to see improved medicine that's going to open up the world for Europeans. One of the advantages that Africa had of keeping Europe out of Africa for a long period of time, or at least mainland Africa, was malaria, and the fact that if Europeans would go into Africa, typically they would get sick and die. Well, we start to see cures for tropical diseases like malaria, or at least treatments come about. That's going to allow for further exploration into places like Africa. Okay. Forms of imperialism we're going to talk about here is just kind of some ideas. You have direct rule, which a parent company sends rulers and the military to run the nation. And that's by far the most costly. You're creating some kind of a military state that is very difficult to maintain for a prolonged period. You have indirect rule, where local rulers are encouraged to gain Western education, and the parent countries kind of influence decisions. And this is probably the one that you're going to see the most commonly used. For an example would be Britain and India, where you take the upper class members of Indian society, send them to England for education, you indoctrinate them into Western ideas, and then have them go back and rule India. So you're going to have Indian rule by Indians, or native Indians to India, that are going to be heavily influenced by Western ideas and Western money. And then you have protectorates. These are going to have local rulers in place that are just going to follow the advice of European advisors on trade and missionary activities. And these are going to be kind of controlled through either, a stick and carrot type situation, in which the imperial government is going to give money to these developing nations for things that they like, and they're going to threaten military action for anything that they don't enjoy. Finally, the final form of imperialism that we'll touch on is spheres of influence, and this is an area of a nation like China is going to be the one that's going to be controlled by this, in which outside powers claim exclusive investment and trading privileges within those regions. And so, you can look at China here. It's a large land-based country, but it's controlled. Certain areas of it are controlled by foreign nations. And so when China falls under these spheres of influence, here in the pink, the English are going to take over large areas like Hong Kong and Shanghai and other areas, I believe. And so, if you wanted to trade with a product that was produced in Hong Kong, you wouldn't actually be trading with the British, or I'm sorry, you wouldn't actually be trading with the Chinese. You would have to trade with the British to get that item out of Hong Kong. So if you're from Portugal and you want something in Hong Kong, you would have to trade with Britain, not with China, even though it is a Chinese resource. Okay, so Africa and imperialism. Here's our little cartoon. It's a pretty good one. It shows you that, basically this idea, you're just taking all the riches out of a continent or out of an area and taking it back to your country. This was going to be a more modern presentation of this cartoon. You would also have China in there, as well as China's moving along that imperialist pathway into Africa. Okay, so really from the beginning of time, whereas once Europe becomes modernized, Africa is really attractive to Europe, right? They have lots of resources. Africa has lots and lots and lots of resources, and Europe wants to get their hands on them. But one of the things that's kept Europeans out is malaria. We talked about that. And then during the Industrial Revolution, you create a bunch of chemicals. You start to experiment with chemicals and chemistry and find ideas or chemicals that will treat diseases. And so one of the discoveries is quinine, which is a medicine that helps to prevent malaria. And so with the ability to avoid getting sick and possibly dead from malaria, Europeans start to explore and further into Africa, right? And Africa can basically be divided into 4 sections. You're going to see the northern Africa, which is the Sahara Desert. But outside of that desert, you're going to have really fertile lands, and you're going to have oil-rich nations along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. And for a long period, that was under the control of the Ottomans, and that's going to get divided up among European nations. You're going to have sub-Saharan Africa, which has grasslands and tribes. And this area is going to face a lot of depopulation due to the transatlantic slave trade. You're going to have Eastern Africa that's also going to see a lot of the slave trade that was going into the Middle East or other areas. It's going to be very ivory rich, it's going to be copper rich, and it's going to be one of the areas of Africa, along with North Africa, that's heavily influenced by the expansion of Islam. And then you're going to have Southern Africa that's going to see a very warrior-like people. One of the most famous tribes probably in Africa is the Zulu tribe, and they're going to be in constant conflict with the Dutch who come and settle there, and we're going to refer to those Dutch settlers as the Boers. That are going to come and settle Southern Africa. Okay. The Boers are Dutch settlers who arrive in South Africa in the early 1650s. South Africa is extremely important as far as shipping to Asia in the 1600s, because you could sail around the coast of the Cape of Good Hope down there in South Africa, and if you could control that area, you can control shipping. And so, the Boers are going to go into battle with the Zulu, and the Zulu are fierce warriors. But the problem for the Zulus is that by the late 1700s, the Boers have industrialized, and they've gotten their hands on machine guns, or at least rapid repeat fire rifles, while the Zulu are still fighting with shields and spears, and there's not much of a competition when you're fighting someone with a gun when you have a sharpened stick or spear. And so as European nations start to go into Africa, we start to see our interests starting to collide. The problem there is warfare and business. Obviously, war makes a lot of money for people, but when you're fighting wars, nations lose a lot of money, right? Like individuals profit from war. Nations tend to spend a lot of money in war. And so as European interests start to collide in Africa, the Prime Minister of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, who actually worked to unify Germany shortly before this time and was a major force in the industrialization of Germany, arranges for a meeting for European nations to come to Berlin. It's called the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885. And basically they outline areas of influence that certain European countries are going to control in Africa, right? And so European nations spent 20 years after that in a scramble for Africa. But it's a peaceful scramble between European nations. And so Europeans have kind of agreed, kind of like, in a way, it's kind of like the first little bit of risk where everybody lays out their pieces on the board, and there's no combat or there's no fighting. Europeans are going to go in and they're going to concentrate on controlling certain areas and not necessarily fighting others. And so the end results are this: the British colonies in the east and south of Africa are given. England's given colonies in the east and south of Africa. Basically, the British had constructed the Suez Canal, and they want to maintain control of that area, so they're going to be given Egypt. And they also want to gain control of the Cape of Africa because they have such a large navy. And so the Cape of Africa is actually given to the British, and South Africa gets ruled by them. So everything here in pink is ruled by England. Egypt all the way through down into modern day South Africa, right? The French are they protect a large portion of West Africa, Algeria, French Algeria, Niger, those places in here, which are going to be very oil-rich nations. The French are going to control those. Smaller nations like Portugal and Spain are able to establish control along the coast, but not necessarily not necessarily large inland empires like France and England. You can see Spain over here on the west coast of Africa. Portugal, which is purple, is going to control different areas here along the east and west coast, different areas that they've owned for a long period of time. The Dutch or the Belgians, it's kind of interesting. Belgians actually control the Congo, which is one of the most resource-rich areas in the world, and that's their empire. The only part of Africa that's not taken over is going to be Ethiopia. The Italians attempt to conquer Ethiopia and are unable to, but they do control places like Libya in the north and Somalia over here in the Horn of Africa in the east, right? Germany, had become a unified nation in 1870, and they basically established rules for colonization that direct the colonies have to be ran for an economic gain, or the parent country would basically lose access to that colony. And so because of that, you can't get overextended. Like, you have to show the other European nations that you're making profits off of those areas. We talked about Italy there. And so while warfare between the European nations during this period was not commonplace, warfare between the natives and the Europeans was. However, the Africans are going to face many problems, right? The slave trade to demolish the population, tribal alliances are going to be exploited by Europeans, where they're going to play tribes off of each other. And then ultimately the Maxim gun, which we talked about, right? It's one of the first machine guns to be mass produced. It can shoot up to 600 bullets a minute, which is, just a ton of bullets. And just African tribes are no match for this because they don't have access to the Maxim gun. They don't have access to the industrial power of the Europeans to mass produce goods and bullets and all of those types of things. And so obviously Africa is going to fall into the hands of European colonization. And that's where we're going to end in this. So hopefully we learned a little bit about imperialization, and we'll come back and we'll talk about imperialization in Africa or in Asia here shortly. Thank you.